So, welcome and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this important debate on fake news. So, before we start, I want to inform you that today's debate will be recorded. I would ask you to put your microphone on mute, and if there are any questions from you, you can write them in the chat or raise your hand. We are going to take questions or let you speak during the open debate. So let me quickly introduce myself. I am Valentina Zoccali, feminist and activist. I studied literature and philosophy at the University of Bologna, and I have been working in the world of media communication for more than 15 years. I specialized in gender study at the University of Brussels, and in 2015, I founded the network Voice for All, Women for Innovative Society in Europe. Since 2013, I have been the Secretary General and Project Manager of Sustainable Communication, or ESCOM for short. What is ESCOM? ESCOM is one of the partners of the Sustainable Information Project, whose acronym is SINFO, funded by the European Commission under the Creative Europe program. ESCOM is an international non-profit association created in Brussels in 2005 by a group of European communication experts and journalists to create a place for reflection and exchange to promote good communication practices and to meet the challenges of digital communication. Since our creation, we have been promoting the essential role of communication in the cultural battle and the development of sustainability, innovation, freedom of information, intercultural dialogue, citizenship, feminism, and social justice. The history of our organization is closely linked to the objectives of the SINFO project, namely to build an international bridge between independent journalism and the network of social and civic activism in today's Europe. We have always been convinced that communication has always been one of the engines of the change in society, but especially in the contemporary era, it has become a real battlefield. This is where all the tensions that exist in society move, all the interest, but also those practices and relationships that are capable of transforming society in a more democratic, equitable, and just way. These are the motivations that have led us to carry out this project together with 3 other European organizations, Teleradio City from Italy, Repubblica from Malta, and Context from Romania, with whom we share the values we believe journalism needs to bring about positive change, social, gender and racial justice, environmental protection, the fight against corruption, and the safeguarding of democracy. Among its various activities, the SINFO project will offer a training course for journalists and activists, free workshops and debates on various topics, from more methodological ones, such as journalistic research, use of sources, new technologies, and others, to the analysis of some specific thematic areas, in particular related to social rights, ecology, and corruption. At the end of this training process, grants will be offered to fund 2 journalistic investigations per country in order to make independent journalism economically viable. Finally, a manifesto for sustainable information based on independent and investigative journalism will be drawn up with the aim of building a broad and solid international network of grassroots media. Today is a very important moment for all of us because the first debate of the project is about to begin. As you know, today's debate is the first of a series of 3 debates focusing on fake narratives. With me to facilitate this debate is Olivero Azeglio. Olivero studied journalism and communication at the University of Louvain-la-Neuve, then performing arts at the University of Brussels and at the University of Bologna. He worked as a trainer, social worker, and a spokesperson for the Rainbow House in Brussels, before becoming communication director and spokesperson for the Secretary of State for Gender Equality, Equal Opportunities and Diversity in the Belgian government from 2020 to 2023. Oliviero is the ESCOM communication manager. Hi, Oliviero. Would you like to introduce the topic of today's debate?
Thank you, Valentina. Good evening, everyone. We're very pleased to see you. The title of the debate tonight is How False Narratives Are Weaponized Against Gender and LGBTQI+ Rights Through Disinformation, Hate Speech, and State Propaganda, and what journalists and activists can do to fight back together. I think we can share the screen to see the title. So why have we chosen this topic? As you know, the development of information production has also gone hand in hand with the creation of false discourses, a whole series of increasingly sophisticated fake news that are sometimes produced by mistake and widely distributed, or that are intentionally created to harm certain sections of the population or certain states throughout the use of new technologies. And about the gender precisely, recent years in Europe have seen the emergence of increasingly strong and organized so-called anti-gender movements. Mis- and disinformation targeting the LGBTQI+ community and feminist or women's rights movement is actually one of the most present and consistent in the European Union. Many appear to stem from current issues, such as the passing of legislation in specific countries. Others are based on conspiracy theories. Before giving the floor and introducing our four guests, we wanted to share with you some general examples and pictures that are framing the topic of tonight's debate. The issue of abortion is becoming highly polarized in many European countries, with the rise of movements claiming to give women the right not to have an abortion. Violence against women is still given too little consideration. Victims' voices are not taken into account. And on the contrary, organized networks and leading figures come to the rescue of men accused of violence. Locking women into the role of mother, failing to find expert women to speak out in the media, or reducing women to the first names or physical characteristics. These are all stereotypes that tell a false story and leave a lasting mark on people's minds. Violence against women is unfortunately still very often presented as the work of a man who loved them too much, as a crime of passion. Victims of gender-based violence are often portrayed as sharing the blame, as being partly responsible for the violence they have suffered. And about the LGBTQI+ people, disinformation narrative aims to portray transgender people as suffering from physical and mental illness, as is still sometimes the case for bisexuals and homosexual persons. These claims often appear as supported by scientific studies, papers, and statistics that eventually turn out to be false or misinterpreted. The same false claims that LGBTQI+ people were the only people affected by HIV, AIDS, or monkeypox, or that they were more easily affected by COVID-19, were also widely disseminated in Europe at various times, helping to accentuate their discrimination. The place of transgender women is often the subject of debate, with its share of fake news in sports competitions, prisons, and public toilets. Other messages, which take very different forms depending on the media and the country, circulate about a certain LGBTQI+ or a feminist lobby, which is said to be overpowering and to impose its vision of the world in schools, in ministerial cabinets, in the police, or the judiciary, or even in the media world. The media play an important role in our societies, both as a source of information and in shaping opinions and attitudes. These false narratives accompany the rise of extreme politics and a certain radicalization of our societies, which tends to attack minorities as its first target, minorities in the sense of power, not in the sense of numbers. And now, I'm very pleased and honored to introduce you our four speakers this evening, with who we are going to speak about this. So we have Rodrigo Cruz for Belgium, is a political sociologist and scientific collaborator at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, with more than a decade of research experience on social movements, particularly the LGBTQIA+ and conservative movements, gender and sexuality, digital technologies, and international politics. We have Victor Ciobotaru from Romania, who's a human rights activist, part of the collective Buhuceanu, that sued the Romanian state at the European Court of Human Rights, represented by Accept Association, the first NGO promoting and defending LGBTQI+ rights across the country. As a PhD candidate on political science, he's researching the impact of religious fundamentalism and the gender ideology discourse upon democratic values and human rights agenda within Romanian society. We have also with us Luisel Vassallo. He's a senior associate academic in media and communication at the University of Malta. She also works as an activist with Occupy Justice, as an author and journalist for the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom. And finally, Queer Collective, an Italian collective based in Padua, with the objective of delving into confronting issues surrounding women's identities and queer existence, tackling discrimination, violence, and patriarchal oppression head-on with the hope of recognizing and dismantling them.
Thank you, Oliviero. Of this debate with the first question to our guest. So, could you tell us what are the most common fake narratives in your country on gender issues? What are the methods of dissemination of those false narratives? So let's start with Rodrigo. You have 5 minutes to tell us about the main fake news in Belgium. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks also for the invitation. I'm going straight forward. Can I share a screen as well? Do I have authorization? Okay, good. So let's go for it. Okay. Is it working? Okay. So I'm going to talk about Belgium, and I will first complicate a bit things, and then I try to discomplicate. In case of Belgium, I mean, it's sometimes difficult to say what's the main narrative, because not only, for example, we have 3 different speaking communities, and then, of course, we are delving into the specificities of each context, and Belgium is a multilingual country. So, for example, in the French-speaking part of Belgium, we can say that there is a lot of false narratives that sometimes also are traveling from France and circulating in Belgium and Switzerland, etc. And maybe in the Flemish part, we have other kinds of narratives. But I would like to talk about one famous narrative that my colleagues from Sustainable Communication know very well. Was quite popular in the past months. It's related to a sexual education policy called EVRES. EVRES stands for Educational for Relational, Emotional, and Sexual Life. It's a French acronym, but that's what it means. So I will tell you very quickly the story of EVRES. So last year, to harmonize teaching levels across schools, Belgium's French-speaking community updated its policy on sexual education so that students in certain age groups could receive at least 2 hours of instruction during the academic year. So as the name suggests, EVRES is not only about sexual education. It is a broader project that is also going to open a space to educators and kids to talk about emotional life, feelings, and all kinds of things that are related to their relational and emotional world. So until now, schools under Belgium's French-speaking administration, they have been allowed to decide individually whether to offer sexual education classes. Unlike in the Dutch-speaking community and Dutch-speaking schools, it was already mandatory. So what changed last year is that the French-speaking community decided we are going to make it mandatory as well. And the change means that the students would have 2 hours in the 6th grade, which means it's for kids, teenagers between 11 and 12 years old. And in the 4th grade, which means teenagers between 15 and 16 years old. So they are not early age kids. And this is an important information because the false narratives are going to say that Evers was made to target kids with 3, 4, 5 years old. What happened is that a very unusual opposition by parents and some civil society organizations, especially religious organizations, many of whom claiming that the project would hypersexualize kids and also hurt the parents' rights to decide how and when talk about sex with their kids. They decided to mobilize themselves. So when the parliament was discussing and approving, there was already some protests around it. But what happened is after the discussion in the parliament, the week after, some schools in the Charleroi area, which is in the south of Brussels, another city in the south of Brussels, were attacked and some of them were burned. So many of these places were tagged with some anti-Evres messages. I think in my presentation, it's possible to see here, no Evres. It's the same image that Oliviero used in the beginning. And social media was full of false narratives about Evres. We can see here like a TikTok, Instagram reels about with allegedly parents arguing against Evers and asking people to come to a protest. And then here we have a picture of a protest that took place in Brussels, in the center of Brussels, in a Sunday afternoon, I think. And what is really interesting is that unusual alliances happened in this protest. So it was organized not only by Muslim religious organizations, but also by far-right Christians leaders. Very unusual, especially in the political landscape in Belgium. I just asked Valentina and Oliviero if I reached 5 minutes.
Don't worry, we are in the time, so you can continue.
Yes, because we think that's really interesting, of course, and we don't want to cut you already. But think the others that you don't have
Okay,
so
so
much.
10 seconds just to finish.
Thank you.
I would say for now that what happened last year with Evres, and it is still happening because it's a narrative that is still circulating, is that the stories on sexual education and kids being training, false stories about teachers teaching kids, training kids in masturbation and promoting dynamics where kids touch each other, they learn about sex, they are stimulated to adopt neutral pronouns. All these stories had consequences. I think burning schools is something quite medieval. And I'd say this is a hot topic in terms of false narratives surrounding LGBTQ.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Thank you very much. So, Luisel, can you tell us what happens in Malta, please?
Hi, everybody. I am going to speak from the feminist perspective, and because I'm more, my research is based more on women and the visibility of women, of course. So and I am not an expert in LGBTQI plus issues, although as I explained yesterday to Valentina and Oliviero in Malta, although I don't generally praise our government, when it comes to civil rights, Malta has done quite well in terms on paper with laws, and even if the motivation might have been cynical in Malta, this government, this present government, but the previous administration, in the sense, same party, but before the last elections, introduced pretty robust and quite effective civil rights in Malta. When it comes to women's issues and the false narratives, if we have time later, I have some visuals that I would use about the biggest lie of all in terms of where I come from as an activist and what was lied about when it comes to the journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was assassinated in 2017. But just to give a general overview, I think on paper, Malta is very good at saying we have this law, we have that law. For example, the Freedom of Information Act, which is on paper, we have the law, but the government doesn't honor it. So when it comes to women's rights, although we have an equality directorate, we have people in place, women are largely, the patriarchy is still very strong in Malta, and women are largely quite invisible, especially when it comes to media, since we're discussing media. So they are visible on the media. However, they are not part of the conversation when it comes to the really important issues, not only concerning women, but concerning the country, politics, the economy, the environment, health. So a few years back, I did a little, because another thing about Malta is that we lack data. So my argument is always, if we don't have the solid data where we can get a good picture of what the reality is, how can we design effective policy in Malta? If we don't know what level women are participating at and in which spheres they're participating at. The same for any other community. We have a big problem with racism and third country nationals and refugees, who are not included in the conversation and who are even more invisible. So then the intersectionality comes into that with women who are refugees or seeking refugee status. The same with the LGBTIQ community who arrive in Malta and are invisible and are, because of the different cultural issues that they have within their own communities, sometimes they face some very dangerous situations as well. But when it comes to women, so a few years back, because we don't have data, I did a little exercise and I observed how women are visible on our local media, especially when it comes to current affairs, because ultimately that is how we form our opinions and we decide who to vote for and how our country goes forward. And I took the national broadcaster, which is supposed to be the standard for other broadcasters to follow, and I followed all the main discussion programs that were on for 2 months for my sins. So I wanted to see how many women were participating and in what subjects. So although I found that, first of all, I found that women were invited as experts or to talk about certain subjects, mostly the percentage went up. It didn't go up by much. I mean, the percentage was 18-point-something% women, and mostly the rest were men. And it only went up because in some programs, they were discussing motherhood, they were discussing adoption, and they were discussing something to do with parenting anyway. The rest, when it was all the other grown-up subjects, they just were excluded altogether. We have a problem as well with the fact that most media houses are led by men. I have to say, this is not, I'm not waging a war on men, but having led a media house myself for 10 years, and having seen the approach, because I didn't have anyone else to look up to, what I did automatically is I embraced and involved more diversity within the programming, within the structures of the company. in Malta, when I did the study, less than 15% of heads of media houses were women, and that was skewed a bit, because in some cases they weren't even heads of news, they were station managers of a radio station. So when it comes to the false narratives, but just to go back to your question, so women are either censored or absent or invisible or ignored. They're there on the media, but they either never quite make it to the top when it comes to news agencies, even though in education there are more women studying journalism and media studies, then the promotions all go and the decision-making places all go to mostly men. And when they are relegated to specific subjects where the glorification of motherhood reigns supreme, and the rest of the, as I said, grown-up subjects they are not participated. There are other false narratives as well, which are propagated by ignorance, I would say. For example, there's a lot of misconceptions about single mothers. Because single mothers are put in a very difficult situation, single parents really, but they're mostly mothers in our case, where the government gives them assistance, but it's not enough to live by. But if you start working, for example, then you have to give up your assistance. And so you have to work, bring up toddlers, bring up children, you know, and no matter what the situation is, they are vilified for having sex, basically, you know. I mean, that's what they're vilified for. And there's a lot of judgment around that. Also, when it comes to domestic violence, we've started addressing this. I'm part of an NGO which is called Mediating Women, and we basically monitor the media to see how journalists report on domestic violence. And very often it's not done intentionally, but because they're so used to reporting and using specific language, they don't realize that they're either victim blaming or they're sanitizing. So they would say a man is accused of having sexual acts with an underage. I mean, call it rape if it's rape, you know, don't sanitize the headline. So we actually reach out to media houses and we work with them, and most of them are very, very open, you know, to this, and it requires training, of course. Also, and this is something maybe I'll go to later, so I don't take too much time, is the vilification of outspoken women. And basically the visual narrative I would like to share with you later is the story of the assassinated journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia and the activist group, which I am a part of, is Occupy Justice. We are all women, we are all very, very angry and very vocal, but the kind of abuse that we get on social media especially, and not only, we get abused by people in authority and we are censored by the people who hold the media power in their hands. So basically a large section of the population thinks we're just there to cause problems and to just because we're bored and have nothing to do, and because we're wives of rich lawyers, as they call us, who should be home cooking for their children. So women who are outspoken, as was Daphne was vilified, harassed, and there was a lot of false narrative about her and a lot of misinformation. She was called a witch, she was called a hater, she was dehumanized visually through memes. So what happened to her happens to other women. She was more prominent because she was covering the big stories, basically. And her stories are being proven right again, even now, unfortunately, after her death. And as I speak, they are developing, and we're getting to know new things. So this vilification of outspoken women, it's okay, like if you agree with the policy and what's happening, and there you can be as outspoken as you like, as long as you agree. But the second you become a critic of the authorities or of the certain institutions who are not doing their job, you suddenly start to pop up on social media, and it's a very organized campaign with large number of contributors who spread the word, and they literally copy paste the same thing. And it might be 100 people, but when you're a single person who is trying to make their voice heard, it can be very overwhelming. Especially when your comments board are full with this copy paste and this horrible language. So what happens then, the women who maybe might think that they might want to say something or participate in the debate, end up taking a step back, as I'm sure many other people from different communities take a step back because of the fear of becoming a target. So this is, I'm sure, a common theme with all of us, where people who, it's double the effort. It's not just having an opinion and speaking it, it's having the courage to speak up, to show up and speak up, which is a human right, you know. It's a basic human right to be able to show up and speak up. So even when we come to discuss different, this is maybe, I don't know if it's particular to Malta, but here we're generally not very capable of debating. It's very polarized, and people end up not having an intelligent conversation. And that goes down then to education, which is the long-term solution, I would say, that I will leave for the later part of the debate. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Lizelle. So it's time for Romania. So Victor, you have the floor.
The question actually is pretty complex. While I was listening to the colleagues that were talking before, and I know that we talked some details about this discussion a few days ago, but while I was thinking about the topic, I think I changed a bit what I was thinking to talk about. I'm about to speak about, to answer to the question you asked, having in mind the experience that I have since the last 8 years, when I started to pay attention to the anti-gay discourse in Romania, and actually I started to monitor some of the communication channels where these anti-gay topics are spread. What I noticed during the time is that actually the narratives don't change a lot. What they change is the way they express it, or the way they bring it to attention again and again. The discourse, the anti-gay discourse is evolving, it adapts in order to find the best way to awake the desired reaction or attitudes among the population. And the desired reaction they want to reach is the opposition or the homophobia. There are few main narratives against the LGBT community in Romania, but all of them try to portray LGBTI people as being a threat to the Romanian society on different levels. And all these narratives aim to demonize the LGBT community in order to attack their rights. While the anti-gay opposition is exploiting the basic fears of Romanian citizens, they, at the same time, they come with, most of the time, actually, they come with legislative proposals in order to restrict the rights of the LGBTI people. And as I will try to show it shortly. The main anti-gay narrative that I was monitoring was that that was presenting LGBTI people and their families as being a threat to the traditional family and family values in Romania. And this type of discourse, anti-gay speech, was not chosen by chance, because in the most surveys that were done in Romania during the last years, family is among the main values of the Romanian citizens. So this discourse portraying LGBTI people as being a threat to the Romanian families were brought in the public space more consistently in 2015, where there was a civil initiative to change the constitution in order to define the family as being based on the marriage between a man and a woman. The campaign lasted for 3 years until October 2018, when the referendum finally failed because the validation threshold was not reached. But even the referendum failed, it was helped to fail. The effects of that toxic anti-gay campaign still persists because of the wave of hate that was created in the society. Even now, this topic, this narrative of LGBTI families being a threat to the traditional families came back into the public space once we got the decision of European Court of Human Rights against Romania that asks the Romanian authorities to adopt a legislation for protecting rainbow families. Another false narrative is that LGBTI people are a threat to the children, and this narrative was also used during the referendum campaign. And this narrative comes also with a few legislative proposals. During the referendum campaign in 2018, there were used images and messages portraying children, Romanian children, as being under threat of homosexual couples to be adopted or to be taken away from their children. Some of the messages, some of the explicit messages, actually, there were: if you don't go to vote for this referendum, your children will be adopted by a homosexual couple. There were also images with graphic images portraying children that are in danger to be taken from their mother and given to a homosexual couple, with the message of the children saying, "Why do you take me from my mother?" To support this narrative, there was also the proposal law or the opposition to the proposal law to introduce the sex education in schools in 2020, when they used the same narratives and arguments that they want to protect the Romanian children against the homosexual propaganda. And in December 2021, a group of parliamentarians came up with a proposal law to ban homosexual propaganda, following the Hungarian and Russian model. Third narrative, false narrative against trans people is used in Romania and is trying to portray trans people as a threat to the public safety. In 2019, there was a law proposal that wanted to ban gender debates in academia, in schools, and in faculties. This proposal came from a politician which had connections with ultra-conservative politicians in America. The argument that was put forward by this politician for that law proposal was that he wanted to protect or to prevent what is already happening in other countries. Actually, the fact that people are attacked in public toilets by trans people. Finally, the draft law was declared unconstitutional because of a great effort that was done by the Romanian civil society and the international academic society. Another false narrative, and I will point it very shortly, is that trans people represent a threat to the women's rights. And all of us heard about the famous question, what a woman is. And the basic argument is that if we don't have a biological definition of women, women's rights cannot be protected. LGBTI persons are also portrayed as a threat to the freedom of religion and conscience. And lately there are, we have in Romanian society similar organization as we could see in America that say that they protect religious freedom by building cases against the LGBTI people, portraying them as dictators that try to impose their lifestyle and their rules to the Christian businesses. The last case that was put in the public debate was about printing shop which refused to print some information, some flyers about the rights of lesbian women in Romania, because that came in opposition with their religious beliefs. So these are some of the main false narrative in the public space in Romania. And the characteristic of these of these false narratives is that actually the opposition is trying to use the language of human rights, presenting themselves as the true human rights defenders, while actually what they are doing is to attack the very basic human rights of LGBTI people and also of children or women.
Thank you, Victor. So we go to Italy to listen the Squirt Collective. Simona, Luisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I share the screen? Yeah.
Okay, I'll start in the meantime.
Yeah.
For Italy, there are a various number of false narratives circulating against the LGBTQ+ community, against women in general, I would say against marginalized people. We can briefly name many, especially because of our current right-wing government having so much power over basically everything, but especially on the news. We have heard basically all of it. Gay and transgender people are sick, and transitioning can lead to mental illnesses, for example, or that LGBTQ+ people have some kind of preferential treatment in sports, which we know, especially in Italy, is not true. And there's also been many theories about the dictatorship of the LGBTQ+ community and what basically our government likes to call lobbying. It's a very word that they love to use, which basically means that, you know, the LGBTQ+ community loves to have some kind of power over everyone, over children, forging them to be part of the community, of turning men into women or women into men, creating homosexuality, whatever that means, and trying to ban words such as mother or father, like every gendered word. And of course, as many people have said before, also some claims of being gay equals promoting pedophilia of some kind. These are like some of many that we've heard, but for today, like for the first part at least, we would like to focus on specifically Italian news that we've seen personally, trying to give like an overview of what we live today in Italy, what we encounter, especially in the narrative of gender-based violence, but also on LGBTQ+ issues from our national and local newspapers. What we've witnessed is a very monolithic narrative focused on the individual responsibilities of the perpetrators, which is lacking context. It's lacking information about the people who are most at risk of experiencing violence. And these narratives are also like conveniently omitting referrals to some help services for women. And also they refuse to talk about any of these problems as systematic as a whole, but rather they focus on specific cases, singling them out. The first example that we bring is these articles that highlights a perfect love affair, the details of a story of love, which shows amazement because it seemed like something that went from being a perfect love story became a horrific story in like a second. The belief that femicide is just like a lightning strike out of the blue is of course false, but that's what the articles provides for us. And this is like, we believe that this is like further violence against the victim, and it leads to believe that violence cannot be either predicted or prevented, because it can arise even from a seemingly perfect relationship without even mentioning that there are signs that we can recognize and we need to recognize, and we should be learning and educating ourselves on how to. This specific example is one of the worst cases we've ever seen in Italy. It's the case of the femicide of Giulia Cecchettin. For those unfamiliar with this case, it is a femicide of a young student of our university in our city by her ex-boyfriend, the one that you see in the picture, who was also very young and also a member of a university, which is something we don't read. And the fact that this case, which was the 125th feminicide in 2023, has shocked the whole country, tells us a lot, and tells us that we have some victims as a country that we see as Series A victims, and some victims that we see as Series B victims. And we are unfortunately very aware of the fact that many of the victims of gender violence are forgotten, are thrown into the void, into oblivion, because maybe they're foreigners, maybe they're from a certain social class. But in those days, a lot was written, especially about the guy, Filippo, the murderer. It basically created almost a new genre of journalism, which followed his life in specific detail, recounting basically everything he did or did not do, such as, for example, the fact that he may or may not have had access to a PlayStation in jail. We had this kind of details, but this led to two things: the spectacularization of the life of the murderer, who then became almost a star in the eyes of the public opinion. And in contrast to another mechanism that we'll see later, it brings also the readers closer to this figure, to the figure of the murderer, allowing them to empathize with him. And this also leads them to the conviction that basically what he did could only be a consequence of a random moment of madness, and not a result of what it actually is, which we believe is a patriarchal upbringing and normalization of the culture that we call culture of possession or culture of rape in our country. Another example on the other slide is a chilling article that we have seen, in which we can see that the myth of the Beauty and the Beast is leveraged. Basically, somehow the victim in this article is blamed for being beautiful and impossible, and somehow she brought in onto herself to be this victim because she should have been like more accommodating to this man. We see this a lot in Italian media. There is both like multiple victimizations of happening, and also we see the perpetrator being a victim in this article. And not only that, but the article specifically separates this case from the all men. So like the murderer is someone who was just animalistic, had like a raptus, had a moment where he was out of his mind. And of course, a lot can be said about this outburst of anger and raptus psychologically, because it perpetuates the idea that this thing can only happen to crazy people, like in quotes, almost as if that's not the norm in our country, in our patriarchal society. And I'm gonna skip to the last slide because I wanted to bring like light onto this specific case, because this is an article that we as a collective have written. And we've witnessed firsthand what the stereotypes and fake narratives can do to people. We've written about it last year because a fellow trans sister, an HIV positive Brazilian woman, was victim to like a horrifying case of police brutality, transphobia, and misinformation altogether. Because we know that violence doesn't stop at physical acts. In fact, it spreads like wildfire through articles, shares, and posts. And that's why we think this kind of moment is very important, because the language used and narrative used are like perpetuating a second violence on the person. The newspaper, the TV jumped onto the opportunity to use their labeling technique, one that we see used against marginalized group all the time, but never against cisgender white men, with the attribution of stereotypical traits used to cage us into certain categories and negative ones. Simply basically using the word trans, immigrant, HIV positive, and never her name, and also misgendering her, was trying to unleash a wave of transphobia, racism, and HIV phobia that we have witnessed. And so they did that. And as the person targeted was marginalized, the media deemed it necessary to not practice the very basic act of fact-checking before publishing anything. They took for granted the version that was released by the local police, which portrayed the assaulted person, Bruna, as infected, perverse, a child molester. And this scenario seemed to echo every kind of negative imagery directly from the 80s towards trans women especially. And in attempt to portray themselves as heroes of the public order, the local police spread a version of events that was ultimately dismantled by the prosecutor office, which implicitly authorized comments and opinions as violent and dehumanizing as the act itself. A wave of solidarity with the law enforcement was also spread, not only accusing the woman of being a child molester, but also referring to her as, quote, a trans. This was a chilling attempt from the institution to justify what happened and constricting a narrative that we believe just undermines a person's dignity. And yes, so we truly wanted to bring attention to this specific case, but yes, I'll shut myself up now. I've talked for a while, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Simona. Thank you very much, everyone. Victor, Luisel, Rodrigo, that's extremely interesting. Thank you very much. We would like to know if you want to react, some of you, about what you just heard, because I think there's a lot of common things in every country. Who wants to begin?
I have a question for Rodrigo. So when the incidents of the schools being burnt, I'm sorry, my cat is being very vocal. When the incidents of the schools being burnt happened, okay, so how did the authorities react? What was there a backlash? Was there justice? You know, that's my question.
I don't know. I think Valentina and Oliviero, if I'm wrong, you can intervene, but I was looking actually for information on if they found the responsibles for the attack, but apparently they didn't. And I have the impression, but it's my personal impression, like the protests, not only the flow of disinformation on Evers, but also the protests, everything was so well organized that I can't stop thinking that they are also involved, you know, the authors of disinformation or people that are, I don't know, mobilizing against it. But of course, we cannot say that for sure, because the investigation didn't arrive anywhere. The authorities react immediately. I think there was a lot of emergency meetings called by the government, and other even European authorities were reacting and tweeting and seemed to be shocked about it. In my opinion, the big thing on the Evers incident is like, and I think it's a topic for reflection, like how those issues became something that can put together people that are normally against each other. And to also to dialogue with some stuff that you said and other colleagues just said, I think, and maybe to respond, because the second question was not only reaction, but like how this landscape affect the work of activists. Well, I think one of the things is it's also putting us against each other. I mean, when you have anti-gender disinformation on trans identities being like a threat to cisgender women, for example, and it creates such a tension, for example, in the feminist movement, lesbian movement against feminist movement, gay movement against trans movement, and this makes alliances and like unified action so much difficult. I also agree when you talk about the lack of data on, you know, those things. Thanks for bringing the perspective on feminism and violence against women. It's a fascinating discussion. There are so many intersections. Thanks for talking about intersectionality on disinformation, because this is a reality. Not only they tend to focus on the most vulnerable communities, but also sometimes touching different communities at the same time. I think on the lack of data, we do need further research on the LGBTIQ and gender dimensions of this information. It's so bizarre that these communities are the main targets, but when you go to the scientific literature, it's still very marginal. Like the production of knowledge on these issues is still very marginal in the literature. We need research to build policy responses to the situation. But just to finish, I think we also need to reflect on what's the role of journalists and activists on supporting regulation of disinformation, because it can be risky. And I think especially journalists are going to agree that some of the approaches are very risky. Like what we are talking about is sometimes having like some kind of censorship or trying to empower some stakeholders and not others can lead to, okay, a situation where someone is going to define, or some people are going to define what's truth or not. And it can be dangerous for our communities, can be dangerous for several communities actually, because governments change. And then you have these instruments on the hands of maybe the far right in some years, that we have several electoral processes now. It can happen. And I also find, just really to finish, I find also very great that we have, you know, journalists and fact-checking communities that want to have this kind of space with LGBTQ activists, because not like until very recently, this relationship was not so close. I think if we go back in time, like a few decades ago, the mainstream media was spreading disinformation on, for example, HIV pandemic globally. And nowadays we are facing a situation where we are kind of equally affected by disinformation. Then I think it's time for an interesting alliance. Yes, and then I will be back in the...
Thank you, Rodrigo. Thank you. You anticipate my next question. So we have seen that there are some common points in the type of false narrative circulating in different countries. So in your opinion, how can journalists and activists find ways of countering fake news, and how can they counter this misinformation? Who wants to start? Maybe Victor, Simona, or Giselle, Rodrigo. Victor?
Yeah, I was actually, before answering your question, I was actually wanting to point something on what Rodrigo presented about the situation in Belgium, because it sounded very interesting to me, because that type of reaction in Belgium society against the sexual education was something rather new for that context. In Romanian context, this type of religious fueled protests against any type of rights, against LGBTI rights, women's rights, children's rights, and so on, it's a pretty common thing because all the protests and all the legislative proposals in Romania that targeted different minority groups came from organizations or groups of organizations or politicians that are that have a religious homophobic agenda. The anti-gay referendum in 2018, which I mentioned, was proposed, came from a group of organization called Family Coalition, which was actually formed by mostly religious organizations, and they were supported by almost by all the religious denominations in Romania publicly. All the other proposals against trans rights, against gender debates in academia, against abortions, were and so on, came from politicians that are part from a group which is called the Prayer group in the Romanian Parliament, which is actually a religious fueled group of politicians which have the same common agenda, which is which unites them, and that common agenda is represented by that by fighting against that so-called gender ideology. So what I also noticed during the time is that these religious organizations and groups managed to exchange know-how from country to another, and they learn lessons what was working in a country, and they pass the know-how to another country. So in Romania, we had the support, actually, no, the Family Coalition had the support of anti-gay religious organizations coming from United States. And the same organization can be found in almost all the country where were anti-gay proposals or referendums. Yeah, so that was what I wanted to point. At some point I studied theology, so that's why I'm really interested in the role of religious fundamentalism in this anti-human rights agenda across Europe. The role of what journalists can do in order to counteract these narratives. I will talk from the experience in Romania. The role of the journalists actually in during the referendum campaign in 2015, 2018 was really important because the mainstream media didn't buy the general discourse of the Family Coalition and the false narratives they wanted to spread. The Family Coalition was forced to spread their information through different channels, which were not the mainstream media. And the civil society in Romania, which was fighting for equal rights, had the support of the journalists, which were trying to present the situation and the whole campaign in a very fair way, and they brought into attention of the Romanian citizens the situation of the LGBTI rights in Romania, and that was really helpful. I guess I think that it's not only the role of the journalists, but it's also the role of the activists to put together journalists with people coming from different grounds to bring their knowledge in order to fight against disinformation, because all these false narratives bring different or need different type of knowledge in order to respond to them. For example, answering to that question, what is a woman? It's not that easy to answer to this simple question, because women is a complex human being, and their intention is to reduce this answer by defining the women by their reproductive roles, their biological roles. But a woman is more than that, and to answer to this question in a good way, and to create a debate, a real debate about this in the public space, is to bring different specialists to talk about women and their rights and their needs, and to give a voice to different women. So it's about the role of the civil society, of the journalists, and of the specialists with different backgrounds to counteract these false narratives. I talked
Thank
a lot.
you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Maybe Luisel, you want to react?
Okay, actually, Victor gave me a very good introduction, because I was going to talk about this collaboration between journalists and activists, no matter how small the group might be. And actually, I am going to share, if I can, my screen. So this is a presentation I had prepared, I have to be honest, for another event, but I want to show how basically this is my pressure group. And my point is, for what journalists need to do is, of course, there has to be fact checking, there has to be collaboration, but working hand in hand with activists and representing people. Because before I said that we are censored by the state media and by the dominant media, but the independent media, the journalists of the independent media in Malta really fought our case. We were born after, I'm going to rush through this, after Daphne Caruana Galizia was murdered. I can share this if anybody is interested eventually. And we decided as an all-woman group to fight because they killed one of us. Because basically for 30 years, she was vilified, she was dehumanized because she was a woman. She was a woman standing up to the men in power because it was dominated by men, and she was showing them up for their corruption. And it was born out of the initiative of my two friends over here, one of whom was not even my friend at the time. And we started as activists. So my appeal is to journalists and to activists. As activists, we understood early on that to get the attention of the media, we need to create visual actions. So something that is interesting for them to report, obviously with an important message. So instead of just releasing a press release that goes buried under 1 million other press releases that are released by other organizations, we decided to go the visual route. We're not an NGO. We just create visuals for you know, this is at the Prime Minister's office, for example. This is against his front door of his office. I don't know, it's not changing. So basically there has to be collaboration. And also I think as activists, we need to demand that there are robust laws because we are fighting quite a large monster when it comes to social media. So journalists have to write the good stories for people to read and to consume, but they are forced to give free content to the social media platforms if they are to remain alive. And that social media platforms that are taking away their income because advertisers are going onto social media and advertising on these platforms instead of going to the media houses that need these resources. So as activists and people who sustain the media and journalists, we need to demand that these things take place. But my appeal again to activists is that we help the media with our actions. We help the media with what we do. Let me stop sharing because we did a lot of actions and we'll end up seeing a lot of visuals that that's obviously will take me into another direction. So the points I made for basically collaborations and what journalists need to do are, yes, sustain fact checking and try and get resources, but obviously resources there's money involved. So it's a very difficult, not to be negative, but it's a very difficult balancing act for journalists, because there's commercial pressures, there's political pressures. So as activists, what we need to do is, one, come together and try and understand each other. Yesterday, when I was talking to Valentina and Oliviero, I said very often, people mistakenly use the word tolerate each other. I don't see it as tolerating other people. I see it as coexisting and understanding each other. It might sound idealistic, but it is possible. Not in the face of big crimes and corruption, of course. There's no tolerance, of course. And to together understand the diversity that brings us together, and demand solid laws, even on a European level, especially when it comes to platforms that so far there isn't enough regulation or legal measures that protect citizens, because ultimately it's the citizens who consume this. And this is where, at least in Malta, the majority of people get their news from. They don't get it from the news portals, they get it from the social media platforms, which is problematic, of course. And obviously NGOs, as we said, and my colleagues have said, that we collaborate with each other and try to find common ground, you know, to sustain each other and help journalists do their job in an effective manner. Let me stop, because I'll keep going.
Thank you very much, Luisa. Thank you. Maybe Simona and Luisa for Squared Collective want to explain how journalists can help their collective in combating those false narratives.
Yes, of course. Well, we believe that as activists and writers and journalists all together, we have both the power and the responsibility kind of to replace those dehumanizing stereotypes and to bring nuanced portrayals of both gender and sexual diversity into the world. And so like we have found some key points that we wanted to bring to you all. While I'm talking, I'm going to use the you generic pronoun. Of course, I'm not referring directly to a person, but I'm speaking generally. The first point is that we believe that you should learn from the community. So as a journalist, before reporting on sexual or gender diversity, you should educate yourself about the unique issue that that specific person or people face in the context of their own community and yours. And the best way to do that is to basically introduce yourself to the local community that you're trying to represent. And while some of them may be hesitant to meet you, maybe for safety reasons, maybe because they're used to bad reporting, it's still important to extend that invitation. The second is basically to educate your audience while you're talking, because reporting can be, yes, to inform and entertain, but also to educate. Some outlets, for example, exploit sexual and gender minorities to entertain their audiences or pander to their fears, for example, as we've seen. But these approaches are, of course, dangerous and unethical. And so instead, we should strive to produce sensitive coverage that educates and informs. And so, you know, consider the people that you're trying to interview, for example, in a way that it's affirming to them and not derogatory. The third one is to basically do not emphasize for or with the perpetrator or the violent person or the discriminating person, to challenge myths, of course, because it's one of the, we think, key roles of the journalist is to challenge those myths and stereotypes and misconceptions. So, you know, do not use sources that repeats myths that you know are false. You can exclude them altogether from your reporting, or maybe bring them on alongside accurate information that reveal the source ignorance or bias. Also include moderate and diverse sources, because there's never just one side of a story, there's multiple. And rather than seeing a whole community as a black or white issue, explore the gray in between. There's a vast majority of different people whose beliefs probably lie somewhere in between the lines, and we should also be considering those. And of course, allow the sources to speak for themselves, because a common thing that we've noticed among especially LGBTQ plus right activists is that nothing should be, that we say that nothing should be about us without us, because of course then the covering of these instances is derogatory or false or not accurate. And then of course, very vital is to use the sources' preferred terminology. For example, rather than labeling someone as gay, transgender, lesbian, queer, ask them what they prefer to be identified as. And if they, for example, like the word queer, but you think that your audience does not understand the word queer, you still use it anyways and define it for them, so you can educate them and to understand what it means. And also, of course, consider the sources' pronouns. Ask them before the interview in a way that you don't actively, misgender them during the interview. Protect the sources, protect the person. And the last two are very important, at least to us. Tell stories of triumph, because too often we see coverage about LGBTQ plus people that focuses on pain, on suffering, on abuse. And there may be sad and abusive stories and realities. There are a lot, but queer people are way more than their traumas. We experience joy, love, moments of triumphs, just like anyone else. And so go beyond the victim framing and go to a more complex and variety of stories. And the last one is be honest with yourself. We have our own beliefs and biases. If you think that you cannot cover LGBTQ plus issue, for example, with honesty, with fairness, with accuracy, with sensibility and sensitivity, find someone else who can, because gender and sexual minorities exist in all of our communities, and their stories need to be told in a way that's comfortable and that's good and that's not derogatory. So if you cannot, just be honest about that and move on. That's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. It's really, really great. Now that's time to give the floor to the public. So if there's somebody who has a question, you can raise his or her or their hand. Nobody. There's a question from Dominic. We listen to you.
Yes, I have a question because Rodrigo said something interesting, of course, concerning EVRA. He saw that different groups who normally don't associate with each other were actually kind of working together in this. Is this something that you see elsewhere, or is it something important? Is it just a one-off thing, or is it something that you see more, or maybe abroad? I don't know.
Yes, actually, I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of the anti-gender campaigns and mobilizations, is the fact that they are bringing together so many actors that are quite like, it's so unusual to see them cooperating. So I'll give some examples. In the United States, in 2016, during the elections, we are going a bit far, but it's a very good example how the channels of disinformation, most of them related to Russian outlets, were benefiting the election of Donald Trump. And they were amplified and they were shared by Donald Trump supporters. Some of them were not aware of that, but some of them were. Another example, going even far, I'm coming back to Europe. In Brazil, there is also a very interesting alliance between Catholics and evangelicals. Evangelicals, now supported by the Christian right from the United States, are very loud in Brazil. So if you watch any documentary, read any article about anti-gender movements in Brazil, And disinformation is one of the main tactics they use right now. You hear a lot about evangelicals, but they are not the only ones. And their main allies are the Catholic Church, which acts in a very invisible way because they've always been there. They are very powerful, but they are not very loud. So nobody knows what they do. Well, in Europe, we have the example in Belgium, but I was talking to an activist today from Georgia, and she was saying that there are many Christian associations in Georgia. They allegedly receive a fund from the United States and from the Christian right from the United States that also kind of cooperate a lot with some actors that are related to Russia. And Georgia is in a very sensitive position, especially now during the war and the invasion of Ukraine. Georgia government in a position that they think that please Russia is more interesting to them to don't be invaded. So these kinds of alliances are happening everywhere. And like, I think, as I said, why? I think now we can come back to the disinformation issue. And I mean, let's be honest, disinformation on LGBTQ things and gender things, violence against women, all of that this is a type of content that get viral because people are sexist, people are homophobic, transphobic. This kind of narrative tap into biases and feelings that are there. They are still there, even in places where you think they are not so strong. So people engage with this kind of content, and this is good for the business models of these platforms. They want contents that engage people. They want people to lose time sharing and talking, and they profit from that. They profit from the conflict from both sides. That's why Meta are like super. They say they are super LGBTIQ friendly. They have internal policies, blah 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 blah. But they also block. They censor LGBTIQ content in the platforms. They are not friends of LGBTIQ movements at all. The same you can talk about Disney in the United States. They support both the opposition and the LGBTIQ movements, and they make rights on the Disney park. They put LGBTIQ characters in their movies. So like they put sometimes money both sides, and they want to see the conflict. The conflict is profitable. The hate against LGBTIQ people is profitable. They are transforming everything in profit, even the hate. So that's why it's so juicy. That's why it's so popular. And I think when you talk about the role of journalists and activists, there are so much space for building resilience, capacity building. I absolutely love everything that my peers said here. There are so many things that we can do to resist, because I don't think it's gonna change. I don't think disinformation is gonna disappear. I think it came to stay. This is the new landscape of media and of the public sphere right now. And we just need to find ways to better live with it, because there is not only one or two or three voices that are legitimate right now to say things. The patterns of production, consumption of information changed, and we have to adapt.
Can I add just something like that I think connects very well to what we just said? While we were talking about intersectionality and how, different voices that want to fight about different causes can come together, but sometimes can also clash because of how maybe also the governments and the news bring us to clash while representing each in different ways and negative ways. I think something that we are seeing right now that's very present, and I think it's very important to recognize, is something that hasn't been done before, probably, or at least not in my life, which is I've seen the tactic of actually doing the opposite. So exploiting LGBTQ plus rights for political gain and LGBTQ plus visibility for political gain while we talk about the concept of pinkwashing. We as a collective have just come from a week of occupation in our university, an intifada for Palestine, to like ask for our university to end all economic and social and political ties with Israel. And I think it's without any doubt that we need to also like bring the spotlight onto that particular topic, because we are seeing now something that to me is very, very tragic, which is the use of queer people to justify the hate toward a whole population, which is currently going through a genocide. And so like the use of a city, which is Tel Aviv in this particular state, as the gay capital of the Middle East, to say that since they support the LGBTQ plus more, then they deserve to live more. This to me is exactly the example of how the news and the media and the government can kind of leverage our identities to put us against each other. So to me, it's very important and very like vital that we are seeing queer people, roughly like thousands of people signing petitions called Queers for Palestine or Queers for a Ceasefire, and using, you know, like recognizing that even though like that, you know, support isn't transactional, and that even if the people that are holding the guns are queer, there's also people on the other side that are queer that are not being recognized. And so, you know, faith-based discrimination is another form of marginalization. And I think as queer people, we do not want to be liberated through the marginalization of other people, especially in this case. And so, yes, like condemning violence also about that, I think, is crucial, because they all wield the same guns, the same boots, the same violence, even if they hide behind a love is love and, you know, rainbow flag or whatever.
Thanks a lot, Simona. So we are a bit behind the schedule, but so if everybody agrees, we can take a question from Julian, Delia. No, don't hide yourself. Come back, please. So we can listen to your question, and after we're gonna go for the conclusions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for this this conversation. It's been very interesting. I just have an open question for everyone, really. For context sake, I'm a journalist based in Malta, and as Louiselle pointed out already, the conversation here, especially when it comes to women's issues and LGBT issues, is very tends to be very heavily polarized. And one of the things which I feel we haven't covered yet, and I was hoping to get the sort of panel's opinion about this subject, is the sort of knee-jerk reaction from the grassroots level. So from people who would be supporting the organized disinformation campaigns that we see in the press and in society at large. So I feel like when it comes to people who support these narratives or feel like they can relate to anti-LGBT narratives or anti-women's rights narratives, there is a knee-jerk reaction of fear. What sort of makes them buy into this this kind of narrative, this kind of disinformation, is this fear that they feel like there's a threat to what they conceive as the family, sort of. So to them, it's a very sort of instinctive reaction, and I find it worrying because as a journalist, it's difficult to deal with, because even if you do everything right, so if you take into consideration that the community and the person who's the subject of your story should be at the center of it, and you basically do everything you can to do the story justice, you will still get that reaction. So you will still get that feedback from this public that shares that sentiment. So what would you say is the best way to phrase an argument that kind of tries to de-escalate that fear, that kind of tries to take that fear of this imagined threat and kind of sort of tackle it from the perspective of a journalist and sort of how to report it and talk about it in general.
I'll start. I don't think there's one answer for this, in the sense, first of all, as a journalist, I think, first of all, go with your honest gut and be fair and be factual and be kind. Kindness is not something we see very often because it's easier to tell the conflicting story, you know, and pit people against each other, as Rodrigo was saying, you know, and create that kind of conflict. Because I teach documentary film, and I constantly telling my students, find the conflict, but I also tell them, report the facts, and be honest and truthful. And I think it's not, in the sense, it's harder for the journalist to be honest, not to be honest. It's harder for the journalist because of the backlash that you get when you're honest. So I understand that and I empathize, but it's not something I think you can fix immediately, because that fear comes from ignorance. And the only way to tackle ignorance is through education, of which the media is part of. But the more we repeat the truth and the honest truth and give people space to explain themselves, and Julian, you can't do it alone. Julian is an exceptional journalist who runs his own blog, but he needs the support of other journalists to repeat the same positive stories, to not victim blame, you know. So it comes hand in hand, even with the fact that journalists need self-regulation and they need to collaborate, because journalism is part of the education system. The education system is not just the schools and you know, as children are growing up and their home education, it's also the media. So as long as you keep repeating and giving space to marginalized and underrepresented groups, you are on the right track. And yes, you will get criticized and you will get vilified for it. But that's not something new to you, I'm sure. Unfortunately, it's the battle we all have to fight as journalists and activists.
Thank you. Other reaction?
No.
Okay, so before concluding, I would like to give special thanks to our speakers who have made this debate rich and stimulating. In the slide, you can see, can you see this slide? Yes, okay. The slide, you can see the next project dates. So we would like to remind you that 2 more debates will be held. If you would like to participate in these debates, just send an email to the address as you can see on the slide. In June, we will organize 4 safer spaces for journalists and activists in Italy, Belgium, Romania, and Malta. If you have not done so, please help us to better define the needs by filling in the questionnaire on our website.
You can subscribe to our multilingual newsletter on our website, sinfoproject.eu. If you are a journalist and you write articles that correspond to the themes of the Sinfo project and you would like to publish them on our websites or on our networks, don't hesitate to contact us at the same mail address. And we thank you again for your participation. You will receive an email with the evaluation in the coming days. We ask you to give us your feedback to enable us to improve our performance. Thanks again to all of you from all the partners from the Sinfo project. Thanks to all the beautiful speakers, and see you soon.
Thank you very much.